The earth is ancient beyond any reasonable reckoning. The ground you stand on has felt the sandaled feet of priests, the bare hands of laborers stacking stone upon stone, the knees of pharaohs who pressed their foreheads to the earth and called out to beings they believed were listening. They were not wrong to believe that something was there, along the banks of the Nile, that impossible river threading like a green ribbon through the golden silence of the Sahara. One of the most extraordinary civilizations in human history quietly took root. And at the very heart of that civilization, woven into its mathematics and its medicine, its architecture and its art, its fear and its hope and its understanding of death, was a mythology so vast, so internally complex, so spiritually alive, that even now, more than 2,000 years after the last hieroglyph was carved, we find ourselves unable to look away from it. This is the story of the ancient gods of Egypt. It is not a simple story. Nothing about Egypt ever is. The Egyptians did not think in straight lines the way we are often trained to. They thought in layers, in images stacked upon images, in gods who wore many faces, in truths that could hold their contradictions without shame. Ra could be the sun at noon, and also a scarab beetle rolling the sun over the horizon at dawn. Osiris could be the god of death, and also the god of eternal life. The sky could be a goddess, Nut, arching her body over the earth each evening, swallowing the stars and breathing them back out by morning. In Egyptian thought, the world was not explained so much as it was illuminated. The way a torch held to the wall of a tomb reveals not just paint, but meaning. Over the centuries that follow in this documentary, we will walk together through that world. We will meet the gods who shaped it. Ra, the great solar king who sailed his golden bark across the heavens and descended each night into the terrifying darkness of the underworld to be reborn. We will sit with Osiris, the murdered god whose resurrection became the cornerstone of everything the Egyptians believed about death and what waits beyond it. We will watch Isis, perhaps the most beloved goddess in all of antiquity, gather the scattered pieces of her husband's body with a love so fierce and determined that it bent the rules of death itself. We will reckon with Set, the god of storms and chaos, whose story is darker and more complicated than simple villainy, and who reminds us that even in the oldest mythologies, the line between destroyer and protector was never quite straight. We will descend into the Hall of Two Truths, where the dead stood before the scales of Ma'at, the goddess of justice, of cosmic order, of the feather so light that a human heart, if it had lived well, might balance against it. We will look into the face of Anubis, the jackal-headed guardian of the dead, who moved through both worlds with a steadiness that even the living found comforting. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. We will climb with Horus, the falcon god, and trace the long war between order and chaos that played out across the Egyptian sky every single day. In every sunrise, in every moment the sun pushed back the dark. We will also pause as we go to consider what all of this meant, not just to the Egyptians who first carved these stories into stone, but to the empires that came after them. Because one of the most extraordinary things about Egyptian mythology is that it did not stay in Egypt. It traveled. The Greeks absorbed it and reinterpreted it, finding in Osiris a kinship with their own Dionysus, finding in Isis a figure so powerful she eventually had temples built to her as far away as Britain. The Romans carried her further still. Early Christian iconography, the image of a mother holding her divine child, owes more than a little to the ancient image of Isis nursing the infant Horus. These stories rippled outward through time in ways the priests who first told them could never have anticipated, and yet, somehow, might not have been surprised by. That is the nature of a story that touches something true. Egypt lasted as a civilization for more than 3,000 years. To put that into perspective, more time separated the building of the Great Pyramid at Giza from the reign of Cleopatra than separates Cleopatra from us here, today. And through all of that time, through dynasties and invasions, through floods and droughts, through the slow grind of centuries, the gods endured. They changed their names occasionally, shifted their roles, merged with one another in theological unions that modern scholars still find beautifully perplexing. But they endured, because they were answering questions that do not go away. Who made the world, and why? What happens when we die? How do we live well in the time we are given? What is the relationship between order and chaos, between light and dark, between love and loss? What do we owe the dead, and what do the dead owe us? These are the questions that Egyptian mythology answered, not once, not simply, but thousands of times, in thousands of forms, across thousands of years, of people lying awake in the darkness beside a river that rose and fell with the regularity of breathing, looking up at a sky full of gods, and asking the oldest question there is: where did all of this come from? The Egyptians answered it with everything they had, with stone and paint and papyrus, with ceremony and song, with stories told so many times, in so many forms, that they became something the Egyptians never set out to create, and yet achieved completely. They became eternal. So let us begin. Let us go back to the beginning, to the moment before the world existed, when there was nothing but the dark, still waters of the primordial deep, and a god named Atum, who opened his eyes for the very first time and decided to speak. Before the gods, there was silence, not the silence of an empty room, or the silence of a forest at midnight, or even the silence of deep space as we imagine it, cold and vast and indifferent. This was a different kind of silence altogether. This was the silence of a thing that had not yet decided to exist, the silence of pure potential, held perfectly still. The Egyptians called it Nun, the primordial deep, an infinite, dark and motionless ocean that stretched in every direction, without horizon, without surface, without bottom, because for there to be a surface, something would have to be above it, and nothing was. For there to be a bottom, something would have to rest there, and nothing did. None was not emptiness in the way we understand emptiness. It was fullness without form. Everything that would ever exist was already present within it, the way a song is present in silence just before the musician exhales. And then, from within that stillness, something stirred. His name was Atum. Or perhaps, in the very beginning, he had no name because there was no one to name him. He simply was. He existed within the waters of Nun as a kind of sleeping awareness, a divine consciousness coiled in on itself like a thought not yet thought, and at some moment that the Egyptians never quite pinned to a clock, because clocks belong to time, and time had not yet been invented. Atum opened his eyes. He found himself alone in the dark water, floating, formless, or nearly so, and he understood, with the clarity that only a god adrift in the void can understand, that if anything was going to exist, he was going to have to make it himself. So he did. The first thing Atum made was a place to stand. He spoke, or willed, or simply was, and from the waters of Nun a mound rose. The Egyptians called it the Ben, the primordial hill, the first solid thing. Picture it, a single point of earth rising from an infinite, featureless ocean. The first distinction the universe had ever made between up and down, between here and there, between something and nothing. Every Egyptian temple that was ever built was, in some sense, an echo of this moment. The innermost sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, the dark room where the god's statue rested, was understood to be a symbolic recreation of that first mound. Every time a priest entered that room, he was stepping back to the beginning of everything. Standing on the Benben, Atum began the work of creation in earnest. What happened next varies depending on which version of the story you encounter. And this is something worth pausing on because it matters. The Egyptians did not have a single fixed creation myth the way some traditions do. They had several, emerging from different cities, different priesthoods, different centuries, and rather than choosing one and discarding the others, they held them all simultaneously. This was not theological confusion. It was theological sophistication. The Egyptians understood that a mystery as large as the origin of the universe could not be fully captured by any single story. Each version illuminated a different angle of the same vast truth, the way different windows in a cathedral let in the same light at different colors and angles. In the version told at Heliopolis, the great city of the sun, Atum brought forth the first two gods from himself, alone. There was no other. Some texts describe him sneezing out the god Shu, the god of air, and spitting out the goddess Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. Others are more explicit, describing acts of self-creation that the Egyptians recorded with characteristic directness and without embarrassment, because the body was not something to be ashamed of, it was simply another instrument of the divine. What mattered was the result. From one came two. From absolute solitude came the first relationship. From stillness came breath. From dryness came the possibility of rain. Shu and Tefnut were not abstract forces. They were personalities with all that entails. They were siblings and companions, and eventually parents. Together, they produced two more children, Geb and Nut. Geb was the earth, vast, horizontal, present underfoot in every step any living creature would ever take. Nut was the sky, arching her long body over him, her fingertips touching the horizon on one side, her toes on the other, her belly a dark canvas across which the stars moved like a slow river. The Egyptians depicted them often, Nut above, her body curved in that great arc, and Geb below, sometimes raising one knee as if trying and failing to reach her. Between them, held apart by Shu, by air itself, was the space where life would happen. These four, Shu, Tefnut, Geb, and Nut, together with Atum himself, they formed the original five. But the family was not finished. Geb and Nut, pressed together before Shu divided them, had managed to conceive children of their own. 4 of them, born in circumstances that are themselves already a kind of story. Nut, it is said, was cursed by Ra, the solar god who had by this point emerged as a refiguring or continuation of Atum, the creative sun force itself. Cursed so that she could not give birth on any day of the existing year. It was Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, who found the solution. He gambled with the moon and won enough extra light to construct 5 entirely new days. Days that existed outside the regular calendar, neither fully part of the old year nor the new. On these 5 intercalary days, Nut gave birth to her 5 children, Osiris, Horus the Elder, Set, Isis, and Nephthys. And here is where the Egyptian cosmos begins to feel truly inhabited, because with those 5 births, the world gained not just additional deities but a family. A divine family with all the love and rivalry and tragedy that families carry. Osiris, the firstborn, was good and wise and beloved. Set, his brother, was powerful and volatile and hungry for what his brother had. Isis, the sister, was brilliant and devoted and stronger than anyone around her fully understood. Nephthys was quieter, more ambiguous, caught between the 2 brothers in ways that would shape her entire existence. And Horus the Elder looked out over the growing cosmos, with the sharp eyes of a falcon, and said nothing yet, but watched everything. Together, these 9, Atum, Shu, Tefnut, Geb, Nut, Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys, formed what the Heliopolis priests called the Ennead. The Great Nine, the foundational family of Egyptian divinity, from whose relationships and conflicts and loves and betrayals nearly every other story in Egyptian mythology would eventually grow. But creation was not only happening in Heliopolis. In the city of Hermopolis, a completely different school of thought had its own answer to the question of origins. Here, the primordial state was understood to be populated by 8 formless, paired forces, 4 male and 4 female, each pair representing a quality of the pre-creation chaos, darkness and invisibility, formlessness and absence, the infinite and the unknown. These 8, the Ogdoad, existed in the none together, and their combined energy eventually produced the first sunrise. A moment of such overwhelming creative force that the whole project of the universe was set irreversibly in motion. And in Memphis, the great administrative capital, the answer was different still. There, it was Ptah, the god of craftsmen and architects, the divine maker who created the world not through physical generation but through the power of thought and speech. Ptah conceived the world in his heart, which the Egyptians understood to be the seat of the mind. And then he named it. He spoke the names of all things, and in speaking them, called them into being. It is, if you listen carefully, one of the most philosophically radical ideas in the ancient world, that reality is fundamentally linguistic, that to name something is, in some essential sense, to make it real. What is remarkable is not that these 3 traditions disagreed. What is remarkable is that they coexisted, sometimes within the same temple, sometimes within the same text, layered one over the other like transparencies, each adding something the others could not provide alone. The Egyptians were not troubled by this. Truth for them was not a single point, but a field, wide enough to hold many approaches, deep enough that no single account could exhaust it. And so the world began, not once, but many times, in many ways, through many mouths and many minds, across thousands of years of people lying awake in the darkness beside a river that rose and fell with the regularity of breathing, looking up at a sky full of gods and asking the oldest question there is: where did all of this come from? The Egyptians answered it with everything they had, with stone and paint and papyrus, with ceremony and song, with stories told so many times, in so many forms, that they became something the Egyptians never set out to create, and yet achieved completely. They became eternal. There is a moment, just before dawn, that belongs to no one. The sky is neither dark nor light, the stars have begun to fade, but the sun has not yet arrived, and in that thin, breathless interval, the world seems to hold itself very still, as if it knows something is coming and wants to be ready. The ancient Egyptians knew this moment well. They watched for it every morning with the particular attention of people who understood that the sunrise was not a given. It was an achievement, a battle won, a god returning from somewhere terrible, alive again, because he had fought through the dark and prevailed. That god was Ra. To say that Ra was the god of the sun is technically accurate and spiritually insufficient, in the way that saying the Nile was a river is technically accurate and spiritually insufficient. Ra was not merely the sun. He was the creative force that made life on earth possible in the most literal, daily, undeniable sense. He was warmth and light and the ordering of time itself. Every morning that Egypt woke to golden light pouring across the delta, across the limestone cliffs, across the faces of sleeping children and ripening grain, that was Ra. Every shadow that moved across a sundial, every hour that passed, every season that turned, all of it moved within Ra, because Ra was the mechanism by which the universe kept its rhythm. He was, in the estimation of his own people, the king of the gods. And, like any king, he had a court, a journey, and enemies. The journey of Ra was one of the central stories Egyptian civilization told itself every single day. Not in the way that a myth is told, with a beginning and a middle and an end that concludes and is set aside, but in the way that breathing is told over and over, without pause, because stopping is not an option. Ra's journey was the day itself. Each morning he was born, each evening he died, and each night he fought his way back to the possibility of being born again. The vehicle for this journey was the solar bark, a great divine boat, golden and radiant, upon which Ra traveled across the sky from east to west over the course of the day. The Egyptians, who were intimately familiar with river travel, who understood that the Nile was the artery of all civilized life, naturally imagined the heavens as a kind of celestial river. The sky was water of a different kind, and across it Ra sailed, accompanied by a crew of gods whose roles were specific and essential. Thoth was there, recording. Ma'at was there, steadying the bark with the principle of order she embodied. Horus stood at the prow, watching the horizon with those keen falcon eyes. As Ra moved through the morning and into the high heat of noon, he was at his most powerful, imperious, blazing, the unchallenged lord of everything below. The Egyptians associated his midday form with the falcon-headed god, Ra-Horakhti, Ra who is Horus of the two horizons, a merging of solar and royal power so complete that the two gods became, in that burning noon moment, a single being. The pharaoh, standing in the full sun of his authority, was understood to be a reflection of exactly this. But the afternoon brought a subtle change. The light softened, the shadows lengthened, and Ra, who had been born as the scarab beetle Khepri, the self-created, the one who rolls his ball of dung across the earth, and in doing so moves the sun over the horizon, began to age. By evening, he had become the ram-headed god Atum-Ra, ancient and weary. His power diminished, but his wisdom deepened. The sun at dusk in Egypt is not a defeated thing. It is a magnificent, heavy, sorrowful gold, the color of old honey, of amber, of things that have lasted a very long time. It is a king at the end of his reign, still regal, preparing for something he has done before, and will do again. At the western horizon, Ra descended. And here's where the story becomes something genuinely extraordinary. Because the Egyptians did not imagine the night as a simple absence of the sun, they imagined it as a place, a world beneath the world. The Duat, the underworld, a vast and terrifying realm through which Ra's bark had to navigate during the 12 hours of darkness, 1 hour for each of 12 caverns or gates, each guarded, each presenting its own challenge, its own darkness, its own particular variety of danger. The night sky above Egypt was not empty. It was a ceiling over a battlefield. In the Duat, Ra's bark was met by the souls of the dead who lined the banks of the underworld river and reached toward the passing light with an almost unbearable hunger. Not malevolently, but desperately, because the passage of Ra through the underworld was the only illumination those souls received in the entire night. For 1 hour, light touched them. For 1 hour, they were warm, and then the bark moved on to the next cavern, and the dark returned, and they waited again. Ra needed these souls as much as they needed him, in a way. Their voices, their prayers, and their acclaim helped pull the bark forward through the dark. The relationship between the sun god and the dead was not one of distance and divinity. It was mutual, reciprocal. The living prayed to Ra above, and the dead sustained him below, and together the whole system kept moving. But the dead were not the greatest challenge Ra faced in the underworld. That distinction belonged to Apophis. Apophis, called also Apep, was a serpent of such monstrous scale that the Egyptians measured him in cubits that strained the imagination. He was chaos made flesh. He was the anti-creation, the force that had existed alongside none before the world began and had never reconciled itself to the world's existence. Every night, in the deepest and most dangerous hour of the underworld journey, Apophis attacked the solar Barkey. He lunged from the darkness with the full weight of primordial chaos behind him, his body large enough to swallow the sky, his intent very simple: to end Ra, to end the bark, to end the sunrise forever. This was not a metaphor the Egyptians held at arm's length. This was a real threat, addressed with real urgency. Every night, in temples across Egypt, priests performed rituals explicitly designed to help Ra defeat Apophis. They recited spells. They burned effigies of the serpent. They spat on representations of him, stabbed them, drove stakes through them. These were not performances of a myth. They were interventions in an ongoing crisis. The priests understood their role in the cosmic order as active, not ceremonial. The sun did not rise on its own. It rose because Ra fought, and because the living assisted in that fight. The primary defender of the solar bark was Set. This is one of the great complexities of Egyptian mythology. Set, the god of storms and chaos and the desert, the murderer of Osiris in stories we will come to shortly, was also the hero of the nightly solar defense. He stood at the prow of Ra's bark with a great spear and drove it into Apophis each night, holding back the chaos so that Ra could pass. Set was terrifying, volatile, dangerous, and also, in this context, completely indispensable. The Egyptians never reduced their gods to simple moral categories. Set was not evil. He was powerful in ways that made him destructive in some contexts and essential in others. He was the violence that protected against a greater violence, the storm that kept the void at bay. When Apophis was repelled, and he was always eventually repelled, Ra moved into the final hours of the underworld passage, and in the 12th and last hour, something happened that the Egyptians described with great tenderness. Ra, in his aged, exhausted, ram-headed form, and Osiris, the god of the dead who ruled the underworld, merged briefly into a single being. Ra Osiris, the sun and the resurrection, the living and the dead, the above and the below, for one luminous, indescribable moment, united. And from that union, Khepri was born, the scarab, the morning form of Ra, young and radiant and full of all the creative force of a new beginning, rolled upward through the horizon and broke the surface of the sky into gold. The priests in their temples exhaled. The farmers along the Nile opened their eyes. The birds began. It had happened again. There are some stories that a civilization tells because they happened, and there are other stories that a civilization tells because it cannot survive without them. The story of Osiris is the second kind. It is the story Egypt returned to more than any other, carved into the walls of tombs, written across the ceilings of burial chambers, spoken in the mouths of priests over the wrapped and still bodies of the dead for more than 3,000 years. It is a story about murder and grief, and a love stubborn enough to reach across the boundary of death itself. But underneath all of that, at its very core, it is a story about one question. The question that no human being has ever fully escaped. What happens to us when we die? Osiris was the firstborn son of Geben-Nut, the earth and the sky, and from the very beginning he carried the weight of that inheritance with a kind of natural grace. He was tall, they said, and green-skinned, the green of new growth, of the Nile flood's aftermath, of a field after rain. That color was not incidental. Green, in Egypt, was the color of life and renewal, and Osiris wore it the way a king wears a crown, as both symbol and substance, as a declaration of what he was and what he stood for. He was given dominion over Egypt and over the earth, and he ruled with a wisdom and a gentleness that made those around him, divine and mortal alike, love him without effort. He had a wife, Isis, who was also his sister, as was common among the divine families of Egypt, where the boundaries of kinship among gods operated by different rules than those governing the human world below. Isis loved him with a totality that would, in time, prove to be the most consequential force in the entire mythology. But we are not yet at the moment when that love would be tested. In the beginning, there was only the good king, the devoted queen, and the green and ordered land of Egypt spreading out in every direction under the watch of the sun. And there was Set. Set was Osiris's brother, younger, wilder, made of different material entirely. Where Osiris was green, Set was red, the red of the desert, of the sunburned and waterless places beyond the Nile's reach, of the stormlight that gathered over the western sand before a Kamsin wind arrived to scour everything clean and pitiless. He was not without his own power, his own purpose, but he watched his brother sit upon the throne of Egypt, watched Isis move through the world with her quiet, devastating competence, watched the people of the land turn their faces toward Osiris, the way sunflowers turn toward Ra, and something in him could not be still. What Set felt, the Egyptians understood as a force older than jealousy, though jealousy was certainly part of it. He felt the disorder that lives inside every ordered thing, the entropy that waits with infinite patience at the edges of all structure, the hunger of the desert for the fertile land. He felt it because he was it. And eventually, as these things always do, it moved him to act. The manner of Set's action varies across the versions of this story that have come down to us. And the most complete account we have was written not by an Egyptian at all, but by the Greek writer Plutarch, working from sources compiled centuries after the events they described. In his telling, Set hosted a great feast, and at that feast he produced a magnificent chest, a sarcophagus really, though no one called it that, so beautifully crafted that the assembled guests marveled at it. Set announced, with the performance of a man who had rehearsed his casualness, that the chest would belong to whomever it fit perfectly. One by one, the guests lay inside it. None of them fit. When Osiris climbed in, it fit him exactly. Because Set had built it to his measurements, because this was never a game, the lid came down. It was sealed. And the chest, with Osiris sealed inside, was thrown into the Nile and carried out to sea. In some tellings, Osiris was already dead before the chest was sealed, suffocated, or drowned. In older Egyptian texts, the murder is starker and more violent. Set dismembered his brother, scattered the pieces of him across Egypt and beyond, ensuring that no burial could be performed, no rites observed, no passage to the afterlife completed. The particular method of the killing mattered less than its meaning. Osiris was gone. The good king, the Green Lord, the firstborn of Geb and Nut, removed from the world as completely and deliberately as Set could manage. And into the silence that followed, Isis walked. What she did next, we will save for her own chapter, because it deserves that space entirely. But the outline must be told here, because it belongs to Osiris's story as much as hers. She searched. She found the chest, eventually, lodged in the roots of a great tamarisk tree in the Phoenician city of Byblos, the tree having grown up around it, as if to protect what was inside. She brought Osiris home. She used her extraordinary magical knowledge to reassemble what Set had scattered, all but one piece, which had been swallowed by a Nile fish and could not be recovered, so she fashioned a replacement from gold. And then, with a power the Egyptians described simply and without apology as the deepest magic in existence, she breathed life back into him and conceived their son Horus before death claimed Osiris again. Because Osiris could not remain among the living. That door had closed, but he could exist somewhere else, and it was this somewhere else that changed everything. Osiris descended into the underworld and became its king, the dead lord of the dead, the ruler of the Duat, presiding over the realm that every human being would eventually enter. sitting in judgment with a stillness and a fairness that his former kingship of the living world had only hinted at. He was depicted on tomb walls as a mummified figure, bound in white linen, motionless, arms crossed over his chest holding the crook and the flail, the symbols of divine authority, and yet alive. The green of his face glowing against the white wrappings, dead and alive simultaneously. Still, and yet somehow, the most vital presence in the underworld. This is what made the story of Osiris so essential, so load-bearing, so fundamental to everything the Egyptians believed about death. He had died. He had been murdered, in fact, violently, deliberately, unjustly. And he had not simply ceased. He had become something new on the other side of it. He had become, in a sense, more himself than he had ever been in life, more permanent, more authoritative, more real. His death was not an ending. It was a transformation, and if a god could undergo that transformation, then perhaps. And here is where ordinary men and women in ordinary villages along the Nile could feel the story reaching toward them personally. Perhaps they could too. Every Egyptian who died was, in the ritual language of the burial texts, identified with Osiris. Not compared to him, not consoled by his example. Identified. The dead person became Osiris, took his name as a prefix, the Osiris Ani, the Osiris Ka, the Osiris whoever this person was, and entered the underworld, not as a supplicant before a stranger, but as a recognized form of the god himself. The myth was not a comfort offered from a distance. It was a mechanism. It was the technology by which death was made survivable. The agricultural dimension of this story was never far from the surface, because in Egypt it never was. Osiris was green, was grain, was the seed that goes into the dark earth and seems to vanish, and then, impossibly, returns. Every year the Nile flooded and left behind the rich black silt, called Kemet, the Black Land, the very name Egyptians used for their own country. And from that dark deposit the crops rose. The Egyptians watched this cycle with the eyes of people who knew what it meant. The land died and was reborn. The grain died and was reborn. And so, the story promised, with great gentleness and great seriousness would they. Osiris made death into something you could face, not without fear perhaps. The underworld was real and its challenges were real, and we will walk through them together in a later chapter. But with the knowledge that the darkness was not the end of the story, that a king had gone there before you and found his way to something permanent on the other side, that the green could come back, that it always had. There is a particular kind of strength that the ancient world did not always know how to name. It was not the strength of armies, or the strength of stone walls, or the strength of a god hurling lightning from a position of unchallenged authority. It was quieter than all of those things, and in the end, more durable. It was the strength of someone who refuses, absolutely, without negotiation, without any concession to the reasonable limits of what is possible, to stop. The Egyptians knew exactly what to call it. They called it Isis. She is, by almost any measure, the most consequential goddess in the ancient world. Not merely in Egypt, where her temples lined the Nile from the delta to the deep south, and her image appeared in tombs and on amulets and in household shrines, in numbers that speak to something well beyond formal religious obligation, but across the entire ancient Mediterranean world, which encountered her and could not look away. The Greeks loved her. The Romans built her temples. Sailors carried her image on their ships. She was worshipped at the height of her influence, from the British Isles to the borders of Afghanistan, which is a reach so extraordinary that it demands explanation. The explanation is her story, and her story is, at its heart, about what a person, divine or otherwise, is capable of when love becomes the organizing principle of everything they do. Isis was the daughter of Geb and Nut, sister and wife of Osiris, and from the beginning she was understood to be exceptional in a very specific way. She was not exceptional in the manner of Set, whose power was raw and destructive, and hard to ignore because it announced itself loudly. She was not exceptional in the manner of Ra, whose authority came from a position so elevated it barely needed defense. Isis was exceptional in the manner of Water, which is to say, she found every crack, filled every space, moved around every obstacle, and was, over time, more powerful than the stone it moved through. Her particular domain was Heka, magic. Not magic in the sense of tricks or illusions, but magic in the Egyptian sense, which was something far more serious. Heka was the fundamental force underlying all of creation, the animating principle that the gods themselves ran on, the energy that connected words to reality and intention to outcome. It was not separate from the natural order, it was the mechanism of the natural order. And Isis was its greatest practitioner. She was said to have obtained a portion of Ra's secret power through an act of extraordinary cunning. And this story is worth pausing on, because it tells us something essential about who Isis was. Ra, in his great age, had developed a habit common to the very old and very powerful. He drooled. Isis collected this drool from the earth where it had fallen. From it, combined with the dust of the ground, she fashioned a serpent, a creature of her own making, beholden to no one. She placed it in Ra's path, and when the great sun god walked past, it bit him. What followed was a scene of genuine pathos. Ra, struck by a venom that his own considerable divine power could not neutralize, called his court together in pain and bewilderment. He had been brought low by something he had not seen coming, which is perhaps the particular terror reserved for those who have grown accustomed to seeing everything. Isis came forward and offered to cure him. She could do it, she said, but she would need to know his secret name, his true name, the deepest name, the one that contained the totality of his power and his being, the name that knowing would give her access to everything he was. Ra resisted for a long time. A true name, in Egyptian understanding, was not simply a label, it was an essence. To give someone your true name was to give them something of yourself that could never be entirely retrieved. But the venom was relentless, and Isis was patient, and eventually, Ra whispered his secret name into her, and she drew it into herself like breath, and the poison receded. She never told anyone what that name was, but she carried it and the power it conferred for the rest of her existence. This is the portrait the Egyptians drew of Isis before the great crisis of her life, brilliant, strategic, compassionate, and possessed of a magical knowledge so deep that even the father of the gods could not withstand her. And then Osiris was murdered, and the chest was sealed, and the river carried him away. And all of that brilliance, all of that knowledge, all of that extraordinary capability was suddenly pressed into the service of something that had nothing to do with cunning or strategy or the accumulation of power. It was pressed into the service of grief. Isis searched for her husband with the focused desperation of someone for whom stopping is not a psychological option. She took the form of a bird, a kite, the swift and crying bird of prey, and flew over the land calling out for him, her cries carrying in the Egyptian imagination the sound of actual kites overhead, that particular keening note that cut across the desert wind. She questioned everyone she encountered. She followed rumors and traces, and the faint residue of divine presence across distances that should have been discouraging. She found him at Byblos, as we have already briefly seen, the chest grown into the heart of a great tree, the tree incorporated into the palace of the local king as a pillar, Osiris sealed within its wood, preserved but absent. The way Isis recovered him required patience and disguise, and a series of negotiations conducted across a cultural and linguistic distance, none of which deterred her in the slightest. She brought him home to Egypt. And then Set found the body. What Set did when he found Osiris cannot have been entirely rational, even by Set's own standards. He tore the body into 14 pieces, some versions say 42, and scattered them across Egypt and beyond, into every nome and region, as far as the reaches of the known world, as if distance itself could serve as a barrier against Isis's love, as if scattering the problem far enough would make it unsolvable. It did not. Isis enlisted her sister Nephthys, who despite being Set's wife had never fully belonged to Set's cause, and together the two sisters traveled the length and breadth of Egypt, retrieving piece by piece what had been scattered. It is told that wherever a piece of Osiris was found and buried, a sacred site arose, which is why there were, across Egypt, so many locations that claimed to be the burial place of Osiris, and why this did not strike the Egyptians as contradictory. He was everywhere, because she had been everywhere looking for him. The land itself held the memory of her search. She reassembled him. She wrapped him in linen, performing the first mummification, the ritual that would become the cornerstone of Egyptian funerary practice for 3 millennia. Every embalmer who ever worked in Egypt was, in some sense, repeating Isis's movements. Every body wrapped and prepared was being tended with an echo of the care she had given Osiris on that original night. And then, with the full force of her magic gathered and directed at the still form of her husband, she transformed herself into a bird and hovered over him and beat her wings and breathed the breath of life back into his lungs. And for a time, however brief, Osiris lived again, long enough. Their son Horus was conceived in that liminal space between death and its resumption, and the fact of his conception in those circumstances, on the threshold, in the impossible interval, gave him a nature that was itself between worlds, belonging fully to neither, which would shape everything about who he became. Osiris descended to his kingdom of the dead, and Isis, pregnant and now genuinely alone in a world that contained Set as its most powerful force, did what she had always done. She kept moving. She hid in the marshes of the delta, in the thick papyrus reeds where Set's reach was limited, and she raised her son in secret. She protected Horus from snakes and scorpions and the 100 other dangers that the marshes offered, and when they found him anyway, when the child lay blue and motionless one morning, stricken by poison, she called out across the sky with a grief so raw and so loud that the solar bark of Ra itself stopped in its journey overhead. Ra sent Thoth down. Thoth healed the child, and this moment, Ra pausing his eternal journey because Isis's cry of maternal anguish was too large to sail past, tells you everything about the kind of power this goddess represented and why the ancient world, when it encountered her, recognized something it could not name but could not deny. She was the force that stopped the sun, not with violence, not with cunning this time, with love expressed at full volume, without apology, without diminishment, without any concession to the idea that some things cannot be moved. She had proven more than once that that idea was wrong. Let us talk about the villain. Except that is not quite right, and the Egyptians would have been the first to tell you so. The word villain implies a simplicity that Set never possessed, a flatness, a moral legibility, a character whose function is merely to be opposed and eventually defeated. Set was none of those things. He was something considerably more interesting, considerably more unsettling, and considerably more true to the actual texture of the world as human beings experience it. Because the world contains chaos. It always has. The desert exists alongside the fertile land, and the storm arrives without asking permission, and the river floods sometimes too high and sometimes too little, and the carefully ordered things that people build with enormous effort can be undone in an afternoon by forces that have no interest in what those things cost to construct. The Egyptians did not pretend otherwise. They were too practical, too closely observed, too intimate with the specific ways the natural world could turn on you to construct a mythology that left the difficult parts out. So, they made Set, and they made him honest. He was the son of Geb and Nut, brother to Osiris and Isis and Nephthys, and from the very beginning he was marked as different. His birth, in some tellings, was itself an act of impatience. He tore himself from his mother's womb before his time, arriving into the world with a violence that announced his nature before he had drawn his second breath. His appearance, even among the company of gods who took remarkable forms, was distinctive in a way that set him apart from everything around him. The Egyptians depicted him with the head of a creature that has no definitive identification in the natural world. Long, rectangular snout, tall, square-tipped ears, a stiff forked tail. An animal they called the Shah, which appears in no Egyptian zoological inventory of real creatures. Set was the only major Egyptian god whose sacred animal was something that did not exist. Something that belonged to no recognizable category. Something holy itself, acknowledged by no taxonomy. This was not an accident of iconography. It was a theological statement. Set was the thing that did not fit, the force that refused categorization, the element in every system that the system cannot quite account for. His domain was the desert, the Deshret, the Red Land, the vast and pitiless expanse that surrounded the narrow ribbon of fertile Egypt on all sides. The desert was not merely inhospitable. It was the negation of everything Egypt valued. Where the black land was wet, the red land was dry. Where the black land produced life, the red land produced death. Where the black land was ordered by the rhythm of the flood, the red land was static, featureless, indifferent to rhythm of any kind. To cross the desert was to enter a space outside the protection of civilization, outside the reach of the gods who had agreed to tend to the world of human beings. Travelers in the desert were genuinely alone in a way that travelers along the Nile were not, and they knew it, and the knowledge made the crossing serious. Set ruled that space. He was its embodiment and its patron, and in that capacity he was genuinely terrifying. The hot wind that arrived without warning and stripped the moisture from everything it touched, the sandstorm that erased the horizon and the landmarks and your certainty of which direction was which, the baking silence of noon in a waterless place where the light itself seemed hostile. These were Set's expressions, his moods made meteorological. And yet, the story that Egyptian mythology tells about Set is not a story about pure malevolence. It is a story about what happens when a legitimate force is displaced from its proper function, when the energy that belongs in the desert spills over into the cultivated world and encounters what it was never designed to inhabit. Set's killing of Osiris was not, in the deepest mythological reading, simply evil. It was disorder asserting itself against order. It was the red land reaching for the black. It was the thing that cannot be tamed, demonstrating, with lethal clarity, that it cannot be tamed. This distinction mattered to the Egyptians because it determined how Set should be responded to. You cannot defeat the desert by declaring it morally inferior. You cannot stop the storm by condemning it. You can only maintain the boundary, tend the edges of the cultivated land, reinforce the banks against the flood, keep the ordered world ordered by constant, deliberate effort. Set, as a theological concept, was the reminder that this effort could never stop. That civilization was not a state you arrived at, but a practice you maintained, daily, against forces that were always there and always pressing. His relationship with the other gods was accordingly complex in ways that resist easy summary. He was the murderer of Osiris, and this was not forgiven or forgotten. The trial that would eventually be held before the Divine Council, with Horus as plaintiff and Set as defendant, runs like a long fault line through Egyptian mythology, and we will walk it in the next chapter. But Set was also as we have already seen, the defender of Ra's solar bark in the underworld. When Apophis rose from the deep chaos of the Duat to swallow the sun, it was Set who drove the great spear into the serpent. It was Set who held the line. This was not a contradiction the Egyptians felt obligated to resolve. It was a truth they chose to preserve. Set was dangerous and Set was necessary. And these two things existed simultaneously, without cancelling each other out, because that is how certain kinds of power actually work. The storm that threatens the crop also breaks the drought. The desert that kills the unprepared also marks the boundary that protects the Nile from enemies approaching from the west. Set was the violence that, properly directed, held greater violence at bay. Remove him entirely, and something worse moved in. His marriage to Nephthys added yet another layer of complexity to an already intricate portrait. Nephthys was quiet where Set was loud, subtle where he was blunt, affiliated with the world of the dead and the threshold spaces where one thing became another. She was his opposite in temperament while being his partner in station, and the unease of their pairing was productive. It generated between them a tension that neither fully resolved, and it meant that Nephthys was never entirely Set's, never fully committed to his cause, always maintaining a private allegiance to Osiris and Isis that would prove consequential when the crisis came. Set had his devotees among the Egyptians, and not only among those who worshipped chaos for its own sake. The pharaohs of the 19th and 20th dynasties, Seti I, whose very name meant he who belongs to Set, and Ramesses II, the greatest builder king in Egyptian history, were devoted to Set without any apparent sense that this required apology. Ramesses named his sons after Set. He built temples to him. He identified himself with Set's power and Set's ferocity in battle, which was, from a military standpoint, a completely sensible form of divine patronage. You wanted your army to move with the force and the unpredictability of a desert storm. You wanted your enemies to feel the red land in your advance. Set, understood this way, was not the enemy of Egypt. He was one of its most potent weapons, a force that became dangerous only when it turned inward, only when the desert god brought his energy to bear against the very civilization he was capable of defending. That turning inward, the murder of Osiris, the usurpation of the throne, the long contest with Horus that followed, was the crisis at the center of Egyptian mythological thought. Not because chaos was new. Chaos had always existed, but because for a time chaos sat on the throne, and what that meant, and how it was addressed, and what the resolution cost everyone involved. These questions occupied Egyptian theology for as long as Egyptian theology existed. The Egyptians looked at Set honestly. They did not make him small to make themselves feel safer. They acknowledged that he was vast and real and permanently present, and that the world required him even as it required his containment. That is a more sophisticated understanding of chaos than many traditions have managed. And it is why Set, for all the damage he caused, was never entirely cast out. He stood at the prow of the solar bark every night, spear raised, holding the line between the world that was and the darkness that wanted to swallow it. Even the gods, it seems, need someone willing to do that. Every civilization, at some point, asks a question that is less about history and more about the nature of power itself. Not merely who rules, but who should rule. Not merely who won, but what winning means, and whether the process by which a throne is taken or defended tells us something fundamental about the kind of order that throne is meant to uphold. The Egyptians asked this question with characteristic depth and characteristic patience, and the answer they arrived at took the form of one of the longest, strangest, most psychologically rich conflicts in the entire history of mythology. The war between Horus and Set was not a war in the conventional sense, not primarily a matter of armies meeting on fields, not resolved by a single decisive engagement. after which the loser accepted the outcome and went home. It was a contest that unfolded across 80 years, according to some tellings, across multiple arenas simultaneously, through combat and through cunning and through legal argument and through trials by the divine council that produced results so absurd and so politically compromised that the presiding gods should perhaps have felt embarrassed. It was a war that revealed, with uncomfortable honesty, that even among the divine, justice does not move in a straight line. Horus came to it, already carrying the full weight of what had been done to his father. He had been raised in the marshes of the delta, hidden from Set by Isis's vigilance, protected by the dense papyrus reeds and by the fierce, sleepless attention of a mother who understood exactly what would happen if Set discovered the child existed. He grew up knowing who he was and what had been taken from his family, and when he was old enough, when he had grown into the falcon-headed god of divine kingship, clear-eyed and composed and carrying in his bearing the specific gravity of someone with legitimate claim to something that had been wrongfully seized, he went before the Ennead and he stated his case. The throne of Egypt belonged to him. He was the son of Osiris, the heir, the continuation of a kingship that Set had not won but stolen, through violence, in the dark. Set's counter-argument was simple, and not entirely without force. He was the strongest. He was the defender of Ra's bark, the slayer of Apophis, the most powerful being among the gods. Egypt needed a strong king, and he was strong. The son of the murdered king was a young god, making an argument from sentiment, from inheritance, from the logic of bloodline, and Set had never been much interested in the logic of bloodline. The divine council, presided over by the ancient sun god Ra-Atum, was immediately divided, and remained divided for a span of time that the texts describe with barely concealed exasperation. Ra himself initially favored Set, a preference that caused considerable tension, particularly with Thoth and with the goddess Neith, who wrote to the council from her city of Sais with a directness bordering on impatience, informing the assembled gods that the answer was obvious, that Horus should be given the throne of his father, and that the delay was not a good look for divine governance. The council debated, they deferred, they proposed trials, and the trials they proposed were, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. The two gods were asked to race as hippopotamuses beneath the water, with the rule that whoever surfaced first would lose. Isis, who could not bear to watch her son struggle, interfered, first hurling a harpoon at Set beneath the water, then, when Set called out to her in terms that appealed to their shared blood, pulling back and striking Horus instead, in a moment of maternal ambivalence so human that it stops you entirely. Horus, enraged and humiliated, did something the texts record with visible discomfort. He turned on his mother. The specifics vary across sources, but the rupture was real, and it cost Horus something. A piece of his moral clarity, a small darkening of the clean righteousness he had carried into the contest. He recovered himself. But the moment had happened, and mythology, which forgets nothing, remembered it. There were races on boats built of stone, except that Horus built his from pine wood painted to resemble stone, which floated perfectly while Set's actual stone vessel sank immediately upon launching, which tells you something about the relative practical intelligence of the two contestants, and also something about the nature of the contest itself, which rewarded ingenuity as much as strength. There was a night that the texts describe with a delicacy that only partially conceals its content, in which Set attempted to assert dominance over Horus in the most direct physical terms possible, an act that, if successful, would have carried in Egyptian cultural understanding a humiliating implication of subordination. Horus, forewarned by Isis, managed the encounter so that the outcome was reversed. What Set believed had happened had not happened. What had actually happened was something Set did not discover until he presented himself before the divine council the following morning, at which point the revelation produced a reaction among the assembled gods that the texts describe as something between horror and helpless, mortified laughter. Through all of this, the trials, the arguments, the interference of Isis, the increasingly strained patience of the council, what becomes clear is that the contest between Horus and Set was not resolvable by any single demonstration of superiority, because it was not, at its deepest level, a contest between two individuals. It was a contest between two principles. Horus represented legitimate inherited order, the continuity of kingship through lineage, the idea that the world is most stable when power passes through recognized channels, when the son follows the father and the chain of authority remains unbroken. He represented the cultivated land, the ordered world, the Nile in its proper course. He was the argument that civilization depends on continuity, and that continuity depends on respecting the claims of those who come after the ones who came before. Set represented something that refused to recognize those claims. Raw power, the argument of capability over bloodline, the desert's indifference to the river's careful arrangements. He was the argument that strength is its own legitimacy, that the world belongs to those who can hold it, and that inherited titles are only as meaningful as the force behind them. Neither argument is entirely wrong. That is what made the 80-year impasse possible. The resolution, when it finally came, arrived from an unexpected direction. Osiris himself, from his throne in the underworld, sent a message to the divine council. And his tone, the texts suggest, was not the tone of a patient god who had waited serenely for justice to run its course. It was the tone of a god who had been dead for a very long time while his son's legitimate claim was debated in committee, and who wished to register his dissatisfaction with some clarity. He reminded the council that the underworld was full of very powerful beings who answered to him, and that the grain that fed even the gods grew in the black earth that he governed, and that he was paying attention to how this was handled. The council, suitably reminded of the stakes, made its decision. Horus was awarded the throne of Egypt. Set was not destroyed. The Egyptians could not destroy Set, because the world needed him, because the Egyptians understood that chaos cannot be annihilated, only managed. Instead, he was given dominion over the sky, over the storms and the thunder, and placed in the service of Ra's bark as its eternal defender. He was not diminished so much as redirected, his power acknowledged, his nature accepted, his role formalized in a way that kept him where he was most useful and least destructive. Horus assumed the double crown of Egypt, the red crown of Lower Egypt, the white crown of Upper Egypt, united on the head of the falcon god who had waited 80 years for what was his. And every pharaoh who ever ruled Egypt, every single one, from the earliest dynasties to the last, was understood to be Horus incarnate, the living Horus, the god of legitimate kingship made flesh, wearing the crown that had been contested and won and handed down through an unbroken line from that first hard-fought settlement. When a pharaoh died, he became Osiris. When his successor took the throne, he became Horus, death and resurrection, and the continuity of divine order, cycling endlessly, the way the sun cycled, the way the flood cycled, the way all true things in Egypt eventually cycled back to their beginning and started again. The war between Horus and Set never entirely ended. Every sunrise was its resumption. Every ordered thing maintained against entropy was a vote cast for Horus. Every storm that arrived without warning was Set, reminding the world that the desert was still there, still pressing at the edges, still interested in what lay beyond its borders. The Egyptians did not find this exhausting. They found it true, and they built their entire civilization on the understanding that truth in this world requires daily maintenance, that the crown must be worn with intention, that the bark must be defended every night, that the black land must be tended, or the red land will take it back. They were not wrong. There is a particular comfort in the idea that death has a face, not because a face makes death less final, or less frightening, or less the absolute rupture that every human being understands it to be, at some level, regardless of what they believe waits on the other side of it, but because a face implies a presence, and a presence implies that when you arrive at that threshold, bewildered, perhaps, or exhausted, or simply surprised in the way that people are often surprised by the thing they have known their entire lives was coming, you will not arrive alone. Someone will be there. Someone who has done this before, who knows the way, who will not be unsettled by what you are going through, because this, for them, is simply the work. The Egyptians gave death that face. And the face they gave it was the long, dark, alert face of a jackal. His name was Anubis, and he was, in the full span of Egyptian religious history, one of the most consistently present, most genuinely beloved, and most carefully understood of all the gods in the Egyptian pantheon. He appeared in the oldest funerary texts, long before Osiris had assumed his role as king of the dead, in a period when Anubis himself held that office, the original lord of the necropolis, the first guardian of the boundary between the living and the dead. When Osiris eventually took on the kingship of the underworld, Anubis did not disappear or diminish. He simply became more specifically himself, more focused in his function, more precise in his domain. He became the god of the threshold, not the king of what lay beyond it, but the keeper of the door, the guide through the passage, the one who stood exactly at the place where one world ended and another began. His origin story carries the particular complexity that seems to attend any figure whose role is to move between worlds. He was the son of Osiris, conceived, in the most commonly told version, not with Isis but with Nephthys, who had gone to Osiris in the night disguised as her sister, drawn by a desire she did not fully understand and could not entirely resist. When the child was born, Nephthys, afraid of what Set would do if he discovered evidence of this encounter, abandoned the infant in the marshes. It was Isis who found him. Isis, who had every reason to regard this child as a complication, chose instead to raise him as her own. This act of extraordinary magnanimity was not incidental to Anubis's character. He grew up held by the woman who had been, in a sense, wronged by his existence, and who had chosen love over resentment. The god of the threshold was shaped, from his very beginning, by the knowledge that grace was possible in complicated circumstances. He was depicted always with the head of a jackal, black, sleek, ears upright and sharply attentive, eyes carrying the particular quality of alertness that belongs to animals who move most confidently in the dark. The choice of the jackal was not arbitrary. Jackals were animals the Egyptians knew well, animals that frequented the edges of the desert, that were seen near burial grounds, that moved in that liminal territory between the populated world and the wilderness beyond it. They were creatures of the threshold in the most literal, observable sense. When the Egyptians looked at a jackal standing at the desert's edge in the thin light before dawn, they were not simply seeing an animal. They were seeing a symbol that had been handed to them by the world itself. They recognized it, named it, and built a god around it, the black color of Anubis's skin. And this is important, was not the black of death in the morbid, threatening sense. It was the black of the Nile's fertile silt, the black of Kemet, the black land, the same rich darkness from which life emerged each year after the flood receded. Black was the color of transformation, of the fertile potential that lay in apparent stillness. When the Egyptians painted Anubis black, they were not marking him as sinister. They were marking him as the god of transformation, of the process by which one thing became something else, by which the dead body became something capable of enduring, by which the soul became something capable of journeying. His role in the preparation of the dead was specific, technical, and handled with a reverence that speaks to how seriously the Egyptians took the business of dying well. Anubis was the god of embalming, the divine patron of the priests who performed mummification. The invisible presence in every embalming house where the long, careful work of preservation was carried out. The head embalmer in Egyptian funerary practice wore a jackal mask during the most sacred portions of the ritual, becoming Anubis in the performance of Anubis's work, collapsing the distance between the human practitioner and the divine original in a way that the Egyptians found not theatrical but genuinely efficacious. To wear the mask was to invite the god into the action. To perform the ritual was to repeat, in miniature, what Anubis had done for Osiris, the first embalming performed by divine hands in the earliest darkness of the world's grief. Because it was Anubis who had helped Isis and Nephthys prepare the body of Osiris. When Isis had gathered the scattered pieces of her husband and Nephthys had helped her reassemble them, it was Anubis who wrapped him in the linen, who performed the rituals of preservation, who ensured that the body was fit for what came next. He was there at the original moment. Every mummification that followed was a repetition of that first act. A sacred technology developed at the moment of the greatest loss in divine history and passed down, in meticulous and careful detail, across 3,000 years of human practice. The implements of embalming were themselves divine objects in this understanding. The natron salt that dried the body, the linen that wrapped it, the canopic jars that held the preserved organs, liver, lungs, stomach, intestines. Each jar protected by one of the 4 sons of Horus, each guarded in turn by a goddess. Each organ understood to be not merely biological tissue, but a necessary component of the person who would need to be whole on the other side. Nothing was discarded. Nothing was considered incidental. The body was not a container to be emptied once the soul had left. It was a permanent home, a mooring point, a physical anchor for an identity that intended to continue. And when the preservation was complete, when the wrappings were finished, and the amulets placed within the linen and the funerary mask set in position, Anubis's role did not end. He accompanied the dead into the underworld itself. A psychopomp in the truest sense, a guide whose knowledge of the terrain was absolute and whose presence transformed a terrifying journey into something navigable. He held the hand, metaphorically and sometimes literally, in the artistic record of the newly dead as they entered the duat. He was the familiar face in an unfamiliar place, the steady presence that prevented disorientation from becoming despair. And he presided over the moment of greatest consequence in the entire afterlife journey, the weighing of the heart in the Hall of Two Truths, which we will enter in full in a later chapter. The heart of the deceased was placed on one side of a great scale. On the other side sat the feather of Ma'at, the feather of truth and cosmic order, lighter than breath, lighter than intention, lighter than the memory of a moment of genuine kindness. Anubis oversaw this weighing with the careful attention of a craftsman checking his most important work. He tested the balance of the scales. He ensured the reading was accurate. He stood at the fulcrum of the most consequential measurement any soul would ever undergo. And he did it with the same steady, dark-eyed composure that he had brought to every threshold, every preparation, every crossing. If the heart balanced with the feather, if a life had been lived with sufficient likeness, sufficient truth, sufficient care for the world and its people, Anubis announced the outcome, and the Thoth recorded it, and the soul moved forward into the field of reeds. If the heart was heavy, dragged down by cruelty or dishonesty, or the accumulated weight of a life lived badly, Anubis allowed the monster Ammit, the devourer, who waited beside the scales with the patient hunger of a thing that has never once gone hungry, to consume it. The soul would cease to exist in any form, not punished and preserved, simply ended. This was called the second death. and the Egyptians feared it with a consistency and a depth that tells you how seriously they took the life they were living right now in the world above. Anubis did not create this fate. He simply witnessed it, accurately and without sentimentality, the way a good judge witnesses a verdict, without pleasure in the harsh outcome, without flinching from the honest one. He was not cruel. He was precise. And in a mythology full of gods whose powers were vast, and whose motives were complex, and whose allegiances shifted with the theological weather, Anubis was perhaps the most reliable. He was always where the dying needed him to be. He was always doing exactly what he was there to do. The Egyptians knew that death was coming for them. They were a civilization that thought about this with unusual directness and unusual calm. They built their tombs while they were young and healthy. They stocked them with provisions. They decorated them with scenes of the life they hoped to continue. And somewhere in all of that preparation, in all of that careful and serious attention to the fact of mortality, there was comfort in knowing that when the moment arrived, Anubis would be there, dark-furred, ears raised, watching the threshold, waiting to show them the way. There is a word in the English language, order, that we use so casually, so frequently, in so many different contexts, that it has worn smooth with handling. We use it for neat rooms and alphabetized files and the sequence of events in a legal proceeding. We use it for military commands and restaurant requests. The word has been pressed into so many shapes that its original weight is difficult to feel anymore. The Egyptians had a different word, a word they did not use casually because they could not afford to, a word that carried within it not just the idea of order, but the idea of everything that order makes possible. Truth, justice, harmony, the proper relationship between human beings and each other, between human beings and the gods, between the gods and the cosmos, between the cosmos and the deep silence out of which it had originally emerged. The word was Ma'at, and Ma'at was not merely a concept. She was a goddess, slight, serene, most often depicted as a seated woman with a single ostrich feather rising from her headdress, or sometimes as the feather alone, unattached to any figure, as if the idea had become so refined that it no longer required a body to contain it. She was present at the creation of the world, there when Atom first spoke the forms of things into existence, there when the first distinctions were made between light and dark, between earth and sky, between the ordered and the formless. She was, in a very real sense, the principle that made creation possible, because without the concept of proper relationship, without the idea that things should exist in a particular harmony with each other, the act of creation would have produced not a world, but merely a louder version of the chaos that preceded it. Ra himself was said to live by Ma'at. He sailed his solar bark across the sky on a course maintained by Ma'at's presence aboard. The pharaoh, the living horse, the divine king, was the earthly guardian of Ma'at, his primary ritual obligation being not military conquest or economic prosperity, but the maintenance of this cosmic order in his kingdom. Every morning in temples across Egypt, priests offered a small figure of Ma'at, a tiny statuette of the seated goddess, the feather on her head, to the god of that temple. Not food, not incense, not treasure. Ma'at, the offering of correct order, the daily renewal of the covenant between the human world and the divine one. To understand why this mattered so profoundly, you have to understand what the Egyptians believed its opposite looked like. The opposite of Ma'at was Isfet, chaos, falsehood, injustice, the dissolution of proper relationship, the state toward which things naturally tended if Ma'at was not actively maintained. Isfet was not just bad governance or personal dishonesty. It was a cosmological condition, a weakening of the fabric that held everything together. When a pharaoh was unjust, when judges accepted bribes, when priests performed rituals carelessly, when the living failed in their obligations to the dead, or the dead were denied proper burial. All of these were not merely social failures. They were contributions to Isfet. They were small tears in the weave of Ma'at. And the Egyptians understood, with the clarity of people who had thought carefully about cause and effect, that small tears accumulated, that a world not actively held in order would move by degrees toward the chaos that waited permanently at its edges. This understanding made Ma'at something far more than a goddess of abstract principle. She was a practical necessity, as urgent and as daily as the maintenance of the irrigation canals, as the patching of the dikes before the flood arrived. You tended Ma'at the way you tended the land, because if you did not, the land would fail, and if the land failed, everything built upon it failed too. Her presence in the court of law was direct and unapologetic. Egyptian judges were understood to be the priests of Ma'at. They sat in her name, decided in her name, derived their authority from their relationship to this principle of cosmic rightness. To deliver a false judgment was not merely a professional failure or a moral lapse. It was a desecration. It was the introduction of Isfet into the very institution whose purpose was to hold Isfet back. Egyptian legal texts show a system that took this responsibility with extraordinary seriousness. A system in which the poor could bring grievances against the powerful, in which the quality of a judge's character was considered as important as their knowledge of the law, in which the obligation to decide rightly was understood as both civic duty and sacred covenant. The philosophical dimensions of Ma'at reach further still, into territory that continues to resonate with unusual force when you encounter it across the distance of 3,000 years. Ma'at was not merely the order that human beings imposed on their world. She was the order inherent in the world itself, the pattern that was already there, waiting to be recognized and honored, not invented and enforced. The Nile flooded on a cycle. The stars moved on a cycle. The sun rose and set on a cycle. The crops grew and were harvested, and the fields rested and grew again on a cycle. All of this was Ma'at, the universe's own tendency toward rhythm and recurrence, and the reliable keeping of its own implicit promises. The human obligation was not to create this order, but to align with it, to live in such a way that your individual existence added to the pattern rather than disrupting it. This is why the Egyptians developed one of the earliest and most sophisticated ethical frameworks in recorded human history, not as a system of rules imposed from above, but as a natural consequence of taking Ma'at seriously. The negative confession, which we will encounter in full when we enter the Hall of Two Truths in the next chapter, was a list of declarations a soul made before the divine council after death. 42 statements of what they had not done. I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not caused another to weep. I have not committed violence. I have not cheated in the measuring of grain. The list is remarkable not only for its length and its specificity, but for the breadth of its moral imagination. It encompassed harm to individuals, and harm to the community, and harm to the cosmic order simultaneously. Understanding these not as separate categories but as a single continuous fabric. And at the center of all of this, at the literal, physical, cosmically weighted center, was the feather. The single ostrich feather that sat in Ma'at's headdress was light in a way that the Egyptians chose with full deliberation. The ostrich feather was the lightest thing they could point to with confidence, airy, insubstantial, barely there, the kind of thing a breath could move. To say that a heart should weigh no more than this feather was to say something extraordinarily demanding. It was not enough to have avoided the worst crimes. It was not enough to have refrained from murder and theft and open cruelty. The heart had to be genuinely light, unburdened by the weight of a life lived in bad faith, in self-deception, in the small daily accumulations of dishonesty and unkindness and willful blindness. that a person can commit without ever committing anything dramatic. The feather did not grade on a curve. It did not take circumstances into account, or make allowances for difficult childhoods, or weight the scales in favor of social standing, or religious observance, or the number of offerings made in temple. It measured what was actually there, in the actual heart, with a precision that no human court could match. This is what made Ma'at genuinely frightening and genuinely beautiful, in equal measure. She was not a goddess you could negotiate with. She was not a goddess whose favor could be purchased or whose judgment could be appealed. She was the truth, not your version of it, not the version your community had agreed to accept, not the version that was convenient for the powerful. The actual truth, as it existed in the weight of what you had done and left undone during the years of your living. And she was also, if you had lived well, the most welcoming presence in the underworld. If your heart was light, if you arrived at the scales having genuinely tried, having tended the fabric of right relationship with some consistency and some care. Ma'at's feather was not a threat. It was a door. It was the threshold of everything the Egyptians hoped for when they thought about what came after. She asked only one thing of the people who appeared before her, that they had been true. Not perfect, not extraordinary, not the builders of monuments or the winners of battles or the patrons of temples. Simply true, in the daily, ordinary, unheroic, absolutely essential sense of the word. True to the people around them, true to the obligations they had accepted, true to the world that had sustained them and that they, in turn, were asked to sustain. The feather waited. It had always been patient. It had time. There is something that happens in a library, if you have ever noticed it. Not in a busy one, not in one full of the productive noise of people moving through their days with purpose and efficiency, but in the kind of library that has been there long enough to feel settled into itself, where the shelves have acquired a particular quality of stillness, where the light comes in at an angle that suggests the room has been thinking, where the accumulated presence of all those recorded thoughts and preserved voices gives the air a texture that is different from the air outside. Something happens there that is difficult to name precisely, a sense of depth, of time held carefully in place, of the enormous human effort repeated across centuries to take the evanescent and make it last. That feeling, the Egyptians would have told you, is Thoth. He was the god of writing, of knowledge, of the moon, of mathematics, of measurement, of time, of magic in its most intellectual form. And these domains were not, in the Egyptian understanding, a scattered collection of unrelated portfolios assigned to a single administrator for bureaucratic convenience. They were a single domain, understood whole, because writing is the technology by which knowledge is preserved, and knowledge is the means by which the movements of the moon and the patterns of mathematics and the passage of time are comprehended, and comprehension of those patterns is itself a form of magic. The ability to know what is coming before it arrives, to predict the flood, to calculate the calendar, to map the stars, to stand in the present and reach accurately into the future. Thoth held all of this together because he understood that it was, at its core, one thing. He was depicted in two forms, equally ancient and equally expressive. The first was the ibis, the long-legged, long-beaked wading bird that the Egyptians would have seen along the Nile, moving through shallow water with a deliberate, unhurried precision, its curved beak probing the surface for what lay beneath. There is something about the ibis's manner that reads, if you are inclined to read it that way, as deeply thoughtful, a quality of focused attention, of methodical investigation, of patience in the pursuit of what is hidden just below the visible surface. The second form was the baboon, specifically the Hamadryas baboon, which the Egyptians had observed greeting the sunrise with a distinctive vocalization that struck them as a form of acknowledgement, of daily recognition of the cosmic order. as if the animal understood something about the significance of the moment and chose to mark it. Both images capture something true about Thoth. He was attentive, and he was ancient, and he was, in some fundamental sense, oriented always toward the light, toward understanding, toward clarity, toward the moment when the hidden thing became known. His origin, characteristically for a god of such antiquity, exists in more than one version. In some tellings he emerged from the lips of Ra himself, born of the divine utterance that shaped creation, which places him at the very beginning of the world's self-articulation. In others he was born from the forehead of Set, an origin that gives him an unexpectedly complex genealogy, and perhaps explains the quality of nimble independence he displays in the stories, his ability to move between factions without belonging entirely to any of them. He was the divine counselor, the mediator, the one called upon when conflict between the gods had reached an impasse that raw power could not resolve. He brought solutions that were not about force but about reframing, about finding the angle from which an apparently insoluble problem revealed its answer. His most famous act of celestial accounting was the one we have already briefly encountered, the winning of 5 extra days from the moon through a game of dice or drafts, the intercalary days on which Nut was able to give birth to her children outside the boundaries of the existing year. This was quintessential Thoth, not overcoming a constraint by breaking it, but finding the space within the constraint's own logic, where the constraint did not quite apply. The year had a fixed number of days. The moon had its light measured out in fractions. Thoth found the fraction of the fraction that added up to something new. He worked within the system with such precision that he was able to create room for what the system had declared impossible. He was present at the weighing of the heart, in a role as specific and essential as Anubis's. Where Anubis oversaw the scales, Thoth stood with his palette and his reed pen and his scroll, and he recorded the outcome. This was not ceremonial. Recording was, in the Egyptian understanding, a constitutive act. The thing that was written down became, in a formal and permanent sense, real, in a way that the merely observed or remembered could not be. Thoth's record of a heart's weight was the thing that made the judgment final, not just witnessed but inscribed, fixed in the written word, made permanent in the way that only writing could make things permanent. He carried this understanding into his most consequential gift to civilization, which was language itself, or more specifically, the technology of making language visible and durable. The Egyptians called their writing system Medu Netje, the words of the gods, and they believed, with a literalness that we should not mistake for naivety, that writing had not been invented by human beings experimenting with symbols on wet clay, but given to them by Thoth as a deliberate act of divine generosity. The hieroglyphs were not representations of things. They were, in the deepest theological sense, the things themselves. To write the name of a god was to make the god present. To write the name of a dead person in their tomb was to ensure that person's continued existence, because as long as the name endured, the person endured, carried forward in the written word past the dissolution of the body and the fading of living memory. This is why the destruction of a name in Egypt was the most complete form of condemnation available. Pharaohs who wished to erase their predecessors from history did not simply tear down their monuments. They sent workers with chisels to remove the cartouches, to chip the names from every surface on which they had been inscribed, to scrub the written record clean of that person's existence. It was not vandalism. It was a second death, more thorough than the first. Thoth's gift worked both ways. Writing could preserve forever, and its absence could unmake what had seemed permanent. The relationship between Thoth and Isis deserves particular attention because it runs through the mythology with a warmth and a mutual respect that stands out among divine relationships that are often more fraught. It was Thoth who descended from the solar Barquet when Isis's cry of grief stopped Ra's journey across the sky. Thoth who came down and healed the infant Horus, working the magic of words and knowledge against the poison that had felled the child. He did this not reluctantly, not as an obligation, but with the full engagement of a god for whom the application of knowledge to a problem in genuine need of solution was simply what existence was for. He and Isis shared something essential. Both were defined by what they knew and what they could do with that knowledge. Both operated in a register of power that was more subtle than raw force, and more lasting than any victory achieved by brute strength alone. Among the Egyptians, Thoth's cult center was the city of Hermopolis, where his priests developed and maintained one of the great intellectual traditions of the ancient world. It was here that the Ogdoad cosmology, the 8 primordial forces whose combined energy produced the first sunrise, was taught and elaborated, and Thoth was understood in this tradition not merely as a recorder of divine events, but as an active participant in creation itself, the intelligence that gave the whole enterprise its coherence. The Greeks, who encountered Thoth when they arrived in Egypt, and immediately recognized something in him that resonated with their own Hermes, messenger of the gods, guide of souls, patron of commerce and communication, and the crossing of boundaries, merged the two into a figure they called Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great. Around this merged figure they built an entire philosophical tradition, the Hermetic tradition, which persisted through the medieval period and into the Renaissance and still exists in various forms today. Thoth, refracted through Greek philosophy and carried forward through centuries of esoteric thought, became one of the hidden structural beams of Western intellectual history, present and load-bearing in ways that most people walking through that history never stopped to identify. This is entirely in keeping with who he was. Thoth did not announce himself. He did not stand at the prow of the solar bark with a spear, or preside over the scales of judgment with visible authority, or transform the world through the force of grief made into determination. He sat slightly to one side, with his palette and his pen, and he wrote things down. He watched and he measured and he recorded, and he occasionally, when the situation required it, offered the elegant solution that no one else had seen. And then he wrote that down too, because the thing that is not written is the thing that does not last. And Thoth, above all the gods of Egypt, understood that lasting was the point. Death in Egypt was not the end of the story. It was not even, strictly speaking, the end of the chapter. It was more like a threshold, a doorway set into the western wall of the world, through which every human being who had ever lived would eventually pass, and on the other side of which an entire landscape waited, as detailed and as real and as demanding of navigation as the world they had left behind. The Egyptians did not vaguely hope for something pleasant after death, the way a person might vaguely hope for good weather on a day they have not yet reached. They mapped the afterlife. They wrote guidebooks for it. They filled the walls of tombs with illustrated instructions, painted in the vivid, particular colors of people who intended their work to be useful rather than merely decorative, because the dead were going to need to know certain things, and the living who loved them were not going to send them unprepared. The collection of texts we know today is the Book of the Dead. The Egyptians called it more precisely the Book of Coming Forth by Day. Was exactly this: a guide, a set of spells, declarations, maps and passwords designed to carry the newly dead through the dangers of the duat and deliver them safely to the place they were trying to reach. Copies were placed in tombs, written on papyrus scrolls, inscribed on coffin walls, painted directly onto the wrappings of mummies in some cases. As close to the body as possible, as if proximity to the physical form would ensure that the knowledge remained available to whoever needed it in whatever form they would take on the other side. What they were navigating toward had a name: Aru, the field of reeds. Picture it with the Egyptians who first imagined it. a vast and luminous plain, green with growing things, threaded through with canals that caught the light and held it. The grain grew taller here than it ever grew in Egypt below, heavy-headed and golden and ready always to be harvested. The sky above it was the blue of the Nile at midday, deep and clear, and without the particular weight that the desert gave the sky of the living world. There were birds in the papyrus stands at the water's edges, the same birds the Egyptians had always known, the ibis and the heron and the hoopoe. And the sound they made was the sound of a world that had arrived at a permanent version of its best moments and decided to stay there. The field of reeds was, in its essential conception, Egypt perfected. Not a foreign paradise, not a realm wholly unlike the world the Egyptians knew and loved, but that same world clarified. The Nile without drought or flood damage, the fields without blight or failure, the community without conflict or injustice, the body without illness or the accumulated damage of years. The dead who reached it would do the things they had always done, but without the shadow that had always attended the doing of them. They would farm, and the crops would not fail. They would be with the people they had loved, and those people would be present and whole. They would see the sun. Ra's bark passing over the field of reeds each day, bringing light to the blessed dead as it brought light to the living world above. It was, in short, a vision of the good life made permanent, which tells you something important about what the Egyptians valued in this life. Not transcendence of the physical world, not escape from embodied existence into pure spirit, but the continuation and perfection of exactly the kind of life they were already trying to live. The afterlife was not a consolation for the inadequacy of earthly existence. It was the fulfillment of what earthly existence was reaching toward. But reaching the field of reeds required a passage that the Egyptians took with the utmost seriousness and prepared for with the utmost care. The journey began at death, when the various components of the self, and the Egyptians understood the self as multiple, as a layered and complex thing that did not reduce neatly to the simple binary of body and soul, began their separation and their individual navigation of the space between the worlds. The car was the vital life force, the double that had accompanied the person through their living existence, and that required the preserved body as its anchor, which is why mummification was not vanity or squeamishness about mortality, but a genuine theological necessity. The bar was the personality, the specific, individual quality of a particular person, often depicted as a human-headed bird, free to move between the world of the living and the world of the dead, able to leave the tomb during the day and return to the mummified body at night. The Ak was the transfigured spirit, the form the successful dead took when they had passed through judgment and been found worthy, luminous, effective, capable of moving freely in the divine realm. The dead traveled through the 12 hours of the Duat, the same underworld through which Ra's bark made its nightly passage, encountering gates and guardians and regions of darkness that required specific knowledge to navigate. The spells in the Book of Coming Forth by Day were not metaphorical passwords. They were understood as real and functional. The correct utterance that would open the gate, the proper declaration that would satisfy the guardian, the name of the specific demon that, once spoken aloud, would lose its power over you. Knowledge was protection, which is why the living worked so hard to ensure the dead went equipped with it. At the end of the journey, in the deepest and most consequential chamber of the underworld, stood the Hall of Two Truths, Ma'at's Hall, the place where everything was settled. It was enormous in the imagination of those who described it. 42 divine assessors sat along its walls, each one associated with a specific nome of Egypt, each one presiding over a specific category of transgression. The dead stood before them and delivered the negative confession. 42 declarations of innocence, each addressed to the assessor who governed its domain. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not caused suffering without cause. I have not tampered with the scales of the grain merchant. I have not spoken ill of the king. I have not diverted water from its proper channel. I have not been deaf to the words of truth. I have not been impatient. I have not caused another to weep. The specificity of this list is extraordinary. It encompasses the grand crimes, murder, theft, violation, and also the small ones, the daily calibrations of character that seem minor in isolation but that accumulate, over a lifetime, into something definitive. The Egyptians understood that a person was not only the sum of their dramatic moments, they were the sum of all their moments. The way they treated people when nothing was at stake, the quality of their attention when no one was watching, the faithfulness with which they maintained the thousand small obligations that a life lived in community with other people generates continuously and without announcement. After the negative confession, Anubis led the heart to the scales. The heart was placed in the golden pan on the left side. Ma'at's feather was placed in the golden pan on the right, and the scales did what scales do. They moved according to what was actually there, with a perfect, incorruptible, entirely unpersuadable accuracy. Thoth stood ready with his palette. Ammit waited beside the scales. Ammit deserves a moment of direct attention, because she is one of the most striking figures in the entire Egyptian afterlife mythology, and her presence there is entirely purposeful. She was a composite creature, the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion or leopard, the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, three of the most dangerous animals in the Egyptian world, combined into a single being whose entire existence was organized around one function. She was the devourer of hearts. She was the second death. She was what happened to the soul whose heart was too heavy, not punishment in the sense of suffering inflicted, but annihilation in the sense of cessation. The heavy heart was consumed by Ammit, and the person to whom it had belonged simply stopped existing in any form, in any realm, forever. The Egyptians called this the second death, and they feared it more profoundly than they feared the first. The first death was universal and could be prepared for. The second death was conditional and could be prevented by the quality of the life lived above, which meant that the Hall of Two Truths was not primarily about what happened after death, it was about what happened before it. It was the mechanism by which the afterlife shaped the living. If the heart was light, if the scales held their balance, if the feather and the heart regarded each other as near equals across the fulcrum. Thoth recorded the verdict with his steady hand, and the 42 assessors concurred, and Horus led the soul forward, presenting them to Osiris, who sat at the far end of the hall on his white throne, wrapped in his white linen, crook and flail crossed over his chest, the green of his face serene and ancient and welcoming. Osiris looked at the soul standing before him with the particular gentleness of a god who had himself died, and who knew therefore what it had cost this person to arrive here, and who understood that arrival itself was a kind of triumph. He welcomed them, and beyond him, through the final door of the Hall of Two Truths, the field of reeds waited in its green and permanent light, the canals catching the sun, the grain standing heavy in gold, the birds moving through the papyrus with the unhurried ease of creatures in a world where urgency had finally, permanently, been retired. The dead stepped through and began again. There has never been quite anything else like it in the long and varied history of human political organization. In the centuries of kings and emperors and warlords and elected representatives and divine monarchs of every variety that the ancient world produced, no institution arrived at quite the same position, or held it with quite the same consistency, or embedded it quite so deeply into the theological and agricultural and artistic and daily life of an entire civilization as the Egyptian pharaoh. He was not merely a king. Kings were common. The ancient world was full of kings. Men who had accumulated enough military force or ancestral prestige to claim authority over a territory and extract from it the resources required to maintain that authority. Kings were powerful, and kings were sometimes brilliant, and kings occasionally built things that lasted, but a king was still, at the end of the day, a human being exercising human power in a human context, subject to the ordinary limitations of mortality and the ordinary pressures of politics and the ordinary uncertainty of whether the person who came after him would be capable of holding what he had built together. The pharaoh was something categorically different. He was a god, not metaphorically a god, not a god in the way that a very powerful or a very wise person might be described as godlike in their capacities, but literally, theologically, functionally divine. He was Horus incarnate, the living form of the falcon god of kingship, the earthly embodiment of the principle of legitimate divine order that had been established when Horus won his long contest with Set and was given the double crown. When the pharaoh sat on his throne, it was not a powerful man sitting on a large chair. It was the living intersection of the divine and the human worlds, the point where heaven touched earth, and the gods conducted their governance of the cosmos through the medium of a body that happened to be also mortal. This was not propaganda in the cynical sense we sometimes apply that word, though it was certainly useful as a political technology, and the priests and advisors who shaped the institution over 3,000 years were not naive about its utility. It was something more fundamental than propaganda. It was a theological model that had been thought through with great seriousness and maintained with great consistency, and it organized everything. The pharaoh's body was sacred. His commands carried divine authority. His presence at the correct rituals, the rituals that maintained Ma'at, that renewed the covenant between the gods and the land, that ensured the Nile would flood and the crops would grow and the sun would continue its reliable progress across the sky, was not ceremonially important. It was cosmologically necessary. Consider what this meant for the person who occupied that position. From the moment of his accession, in a ceremony of extraordinary complexity that enacted the mythological transfer of divine kingship from the deceased Osiris to the living Horus, reenacting in ritual the settlement of the great divine contest, the pharaoh ceased to be fully human in the sense that everyone around him was human. He became something else, something that stood at the boundary between the mortal world and the divine one, belonging fully to neither, responsible to both. His daily life was structured accordingly. He rose with the sun and performed the morning rituals that welcomed Ra's arrival. He ate food that was first offered to the gods, the divine essence absorbed by the statue in the sanctuary, and the physical substance consumed by the king, a communion of sorts, a daily renewal of his divine connection. He wore the double crown that united Upper and Lower Egypt, the two lands, into a single divine jurisdiction. He carried the crook and the flail, the symbols of divine sovereignty that Osiris himself had carried, the symbols that marked him as the earthly continuation of a kingship that began before the world was fully formed. And he built. The building impulse of the Egyptian pharaohs was not merely ambition or vanity, though both of those human qualities were certainly present in men who were also, beneath the theology, human beings with all that entails. It was theological obligation. To build a temple was to create on earth a replica of the primordial mound, the Ben, the first solid thing that rose from Nun's waters at creation's dawn, and in doing so to renew the act of creation itself, to assert the permanence of the ordered world against the chaos that always waited at its edges. Every temple built was a statement that Ma'at endured. Every obelisk raised was a spike of concentrated solar energy driven into the earth, a physical argument that Ra's power was real and present and anchored in this specific place, the pyramids at Giza. Those extraordinary geometric arguments against the tendency of things to dissolve and disperse were built by pharaohs of the Old Kingdom who understood the structure of a pyramid not merely as an engineering achievement, but as a theological one. The pyramid was the primordial mound given permanent form. The smooth limestone surface, originally cased in gleaming white Tura limestone that would have caught the sun from extraordinary distances, was a reflective surface. A mirror held up to Ra's light, a joining of earth and sky at the apex where the stone came to its point and reached toward heaven. The pharaoh buried within it was not hidden. He was placed at the center of a machine designed to facilitate his transformation from the living Horus to the eternal Osiris, to launch his soul upward through the pyramid's narrow shafts toward the circumpolar stars that never set, the stars the Egyptians called the imperishable ones. The greatest of the pyramid builders, Khufu, whom the Greeks called Cheops, built the largest stone structure in human history at Giza around 2560 BCE, and it remained the tallest structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. We do not know very much about Khufu the man. We have one small ivory figurine barely 3 inches tall, which is the only confirmed portrait of the pharaoh who built the Great Pyramid. The disproportion is almost comic, and somehow also moving. The monument is incomprehensible in its scale. The man fits in a palm. Later pharaohs expressed their divine mandate through different but equally extraordinary means. Hatshepsut, one of the few women to rule Egypt as pharaoh in her own right, not as regent but as king, wearing the double crown and the ceremonial beard and the full regalia of divine sovereignty, built a mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri of such elegant colonnaded beauty that it still startles visitors who arrive at it across the desert plateau. She sent trading expeditions to the land of Punt, returning with myrrh trees and exotic animals and quantities of gold, and she recorded all of it on her temple walls with the particular satisfaction of someone who has done something excellent and knows it and wants the gods and posterity to know it too. Akhenaten, the pharaoh who in the 14th century BCE made the most radical theological move in Egyptian history, dismantling the traditional pantheon and declaring the sun disk Aten to be the sole divine principle, closing temples and redirecting the enormous tributary flow of Egyptian religious life toward a single abstract solar force, was also, in his own way, expressing the pharaonic logic of divine authority. If the pharaoh was the living god, then his theological pronouncements carried the weight of divine revelation. Akhenaten was not a madman or an iconoclast. He was a pharaoh, pursuing the institutional logic of his position to an extreme that no one before him had attempted. The fact that his successors, including the famous Tutankhamun, who restored the old gods and whose tomb, sealed for over 3,000 years, would astound the 20th century, when Howard Carter opened it in 1922, reversed everything he had done, does not diminish the extraordinary nature of what he attempted. It simply demonstrates that Ma'at, in the end, had more inertia than any single king. Ramesses II, who ruled for 67 years in the 13th century BCE and built more monuments than any other pharaoh, understood the public dimension of divine kingship with a brilliance that bordered on genius. He inscribed his victories, including the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites, which was at best a draw, and which Ramesses presented as a triumph of solo heroism, on a scale that would have impressed a less skeptical readership, on temple walls from Abu Simbel to the Delta, ensuring that for as long as stone lasted, the image of Ramesses as the divine warrior king would be available to anyone who looked. He fathered over 100 children. He outlived most of them. He was still building when he died at approximately 90 years old, which in the ancient world was an age so exceptional, it must have seemed to those around him like confirmation of the divine nature they had always formally acknowledged. When a pharaoh died, the transition was managed with the same theological precision that had governed his living tenure. He became Osiris, literally, formally, ritually. His name was preceded by the Osiris epithet. His body was mummified with the same care that Anubis and Isis had given to the original Osiris on that first terrible night after Set had done his worst. His tomb was stocked and sealed and inscribed with everything he would need on the other side. And his successor took the double crown and became Horus. And the cycle that had been established when the divine council finally ruled in favor of the son of the murdered king resumed its turning as it had always turned, as the Egyptians trusted it always would. The pharaoh was the axle around which Egyptian civilization rotated for 3,000 years. He was the point where the mythological and the political and the agricultural and the divine all converged into a single human body wearing a double crown, standing in the sun that Ra provided, on the black earth that Osiris governed, under the sky that Nut arched over everything with her star-scattered body, watched by the falcon eyes of Horus, and the patient dark eyes of Anubis, and the still feathered gaze of Ma'at. He was the story made flesh. And for 3,000 years, Egypt believed it. Every civilization eventually ends. The armies arrive, or the climate shifts, or the administrative structures that held a complex society in its shape for centuries quietly lose their coherence, and something that seemed permanent reveals itself to have been, like all human things, provisional. Egypt was no exception to this. The last hieroglyph was carved in 394 CE on the walls of the temple at Philae, in the reign of a Roman emperor who had already largely converted his empire to Christianity. The temple priests who carved it were among the last people alive who could read it. Within a generation, that knowledge was gone, sealed inside the stone walls of tombs and temples, illegible to the world that continued moving past them, until a French scholar named Jean-François Champollion sat down with the Rosetta Stone in 1822 and cracked the code that had been locked for 14 centuries. But here is the thing about Egypt that the silence of those 14 centuries obscures. The gods did not wait inside the stone. They had already left. Long before the last hieroglyph was carved, long before the Roman legions arrived to administer a province they found bewildering and magnificent in roughly equal measure, the gods of Egypt had been moving, traveling with merchants and soldiers and sailors and scholars, and the general irresistible flow of ideas between cultures that proximity and trade and curiosity produce. They had been absorbed and reinterpreted and renamed and carried forward into traditions that did not always acknowledge their Egyptian origin, and sometimes did not know it, and sometimes knew it very well, and simply incorporated it without ceremony, because it was useful and true and worth keeping. The Greeks arrived in Egypt with Alexander the Great in 332 BCE, and what happened next was one of the most remarkable cultural exchanges in the ancient world. The Greeks did not encounter Egyptian religion as foreigners encountering something alien. They encountered it as people who immediately recognized the shapes of things they already knew, seen from a different angle, carrying different names, elaborated with a depth and a systematicity that genuinely impressed them. Herodotus had already visited Egypt a century earlier, and written about it with the particular fascination of someone who suspects he is in the presence of something very old and very serious. He identified Egyptian gods with Greek ones, Osiris with Dionysus, Thoth with Hermes, Neith with Athena, Hathor with Aphrodite, not because he thought the traditions were identical, but because he recognized that they were reaching towards similar truths through different symbolic vocabularies. The Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander's death went further still, developing a deliberate policy of theological synthesis. They created a new god, Serapis, who combined Osiris and Apis, the sacred bull of Memphis, with elements of Zeus and Dionysus, a deliberately composite figure designed to be accessible to both Greek and Egyptian worshippers simultaneously. Serapis temples appeared across the Mediterranean. The project of fusion was real and ongoing and productive, generating religious forms that neither tradition had arrived at alone. But it was Isis who traveled furthest and lasted longest. Her cult spread across the Hellenistic world with a momentum that speaks to something in her story that transcended cultural specificity. Something in the image of the devoted wife, the fierce mother, the practitioner of extraordinary magic in the service of love, that people across the Mediterranean recognized as true regardless of what name they were raised to give her. She had temples in Greece and in Rome. She had devotees among Roman aristocrats and legionary soldiers and merchants and slaves. Apuleius, the 2nd century Roman author whose novel The Golden Ass contains one of the most beautiful surviving descriptions of an ancient divine revelation, depicted his protagonist rescued from a life of misery by the direct intervention of Isis herself, the goddess appearing in a dream of such vividness and compassion that the pagan Roman reading it and the modern reader encountering it across 2,000 years feel with some discomfort equally addressed. She had temples in Roman Britain. Her image was carried on ships trading along the Red Sea coast. Sailors prayed to her for calm water and favorable winds, calling her Stella Maris, Star of the Sea, a title that would be inherited centuries later by the Virgin Mary. That inheritance was not coincidental, and serious scholars of early Christianity have traced the connections with appropriate care and appropriate caution, because the territory is complex and the lines of influence are rarely straight. But the image of a mother holding her divine infant, an image that would become one of the most reproduced and venerated in the entire history of Western art, had an ancient precedent in Egypt, where Isis nursing the infant Horus had been represented in sculpture and painting for centuries before the Common Era. The formal, frontal, tender image of the Divine Mother and Child was not invented by Christianity. It was inherited through the long, winding, often unacknowledged passage of images across centuries and cultures from the banks of the Nile. The influence of Egyptian theology on the development of monotheism is a subject that requires more space than a single chapter can provide, but it cannot be left entirely unaddressed. Akhenaten's experiment with Aten, the sole divine principle, the abstract solar force that stood behind all visible phenomena, the God without image or mythology, known only through the light that sustained all life, anticipated by several centuries the emergence of monotheistic traditions in the ancient Near East, and left traces in texts and theological arguments that scholars continue to debate. The Psalm 104 of the Hebrew Bible bears a relationship to Akhenaten's great hymn to the Aten that is close enough to require explanation, and the explanations offered have filled libraries. What moved between these traditions, and how, and through whom, remains genuinely uncertain. But that something moved is difficult to deny. The concept of Ma'at, cosmic justice, the idea that the universe has a moral structure and that human behavior is measured against it, resonated through Greek philosophy in ways the Greeks themselves sometimes acknowledged. Plato's conception of a divine ordering principle, the logos, carries Egyptian inflection. The Hermetic philosophical tradition, which built itself explicitly around the figure of Hermes Trismegistus, the merged Thoth and Hermes, was a significant current in late antique philosophy and theology, influencing early Christian thinkers and flowing forward into the Renaissance, where figures like Marsilio Ficino translated the Hermetic texts and found in them something that seemed to confirm and deepen the Neoplatonist tradition they were already developing. The shadow of Thoth fell across the Florentine Academy, across the development of Renaissance humanism, across the emergence of Western esoteric traditions that persist into the present day. The physical legacy of Egypt is so well known as to require only brief acknowledgement here, though the brevity should not suggest the scale. The pyramids at Giza, still standing, still drawing the eye upward toward the point where stone meets sky, are the oldest of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and the only one that survives intact. The temples at Karnak and Luxor, at Abu Simbel and Abydos and Edfu and Philae, contain within their walls an artistic and theological record of extraordinary completeness. 3,000 years of a civilization's conversation with its own gods, preserved in stone that the desert climate has treated with remarkable gentleness. The treasures from Tutankhamun's tomb, discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, and still capable of stopping a room full of people in complete silence, are not merely beautiful objects. They are a concentrated expression of everything Egyptian theology believed about death and transformation, and the survival of the self through the careful preservation of the things that mattered. The influence extends into our own cultural moment in ways we rarely pause to trace. The Eye of Horus, the Wedjat, the protective eye of the falcon god, appears on modern amulets and tattoos, and in corners of popular culture that have entirely forgotten what they are reproducing. The imagery of judgment, the scales, the weighing of the soul against a moral standard, the accounting that awaits the dead, runs through Western religious imagination, informs that owe more to the Hall of Two Truths than most of the people invoking it realize. The pyramid, with its all-seeing eye, appears on the American dollar bill in a piece of Masonic symbolism that connects, however indirectly, to the Hermetic tradition that connects to Thoth in his ibis-headed form, recording the outcomes of divine judgment with his steady hand. None of this happened by accident. It happened because the Egyptians were asking questions that do not have expiration dates, questions about justice and mortality and the nature of the divine and the obligations of the living to each other and to the dead. And they were asking them with a seriousness and a sophistication and a consistency across centuries that generated answers of unusual durability. The answers changed form as they traveled. They acquired new names and new contexts and new symbolic vocabularies. But the questions underneath them remained, and the shapes of the answers the Egyptians found remained recognizable in the shapes of the answers that came after. The way a river's course remains visible in the landscape long after the river itself has changed. The last temple to Isis was closed in the 6th century CE by order of the Emperor Justinian. The priests were dispersed, the rituals ceased. The long, unbroken thread of living practice that had run from the earliest dynasties of Egyptian history to the late Roman Empire was finally, officially, cut. But the questions did not stop. They never do. Somewhere in the human inheritance, in the image of the devoted mother searching for what she has lost, in the idea that a heart can be weighed against a feather and found either light or wanting, in the understanding that chaos is real and permanent and requires daily opposition, in the knowledge that the sun sets each evening into something terrifying and rises each morning because something in the dark fought for it, the gods of Egypt continue their patient, ancient work. Not in temples now, not in the mouths of priests performing rituals in columned halls before statues that hold the divine presence in their carved and painted faces. In us, in the questions we cannot stop asking, no matter how many centuries we put between ourselves and the people who first carved the answers into stone beside a green river in a golden desert, and looked up at the sky and saw the gods looking back.